So we started looking at all political donations from the State Department. We looked at them for USAID. And what did we find? For State Department, it was like 94% went to the left. At USAID, it was like 98% that went to the left. National Endowment for Democracy, like 95% to the left. And then we started looking at all of the partners, the international NGOs, the contractors, and started looking at all of them where the billions and billions are going. And 95, 98%. Even World Vision Catholic Relief Services, the vast majority, well over 90% of their political donations were going to the left. You look at the boards, they're all prominent people making very high salaries. So when you think about what's happened, the left, which was misusing USAID, and they're doing this across the federal government, misusing taxpayer money as a slush fund to finance their own people. Mm-hmm. And these are folks that can go out there, do the media, be the foot soldiers of the left, give money back. And so you had a one-sided uni-party apparatus here funding only one side of the political equation. And thank you, U.S. taxpayer. So we started looking at...
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You may be aware that there's talk of a conclave. If you've been paying any attention to news in the church, you know we're talking these days a lot about a conclave coming. And what sets the stage for a conclave is, quite frankly, something called, well, there's factions, right? They go into the conclave. These are the groups of cardinals on one side or the other, or three, who knows how many factions. But they each have their own preferred candidate. And then there's a bunch of other cardinals who aren't in on the action. There are always insiders and outsiders. And then the whole lobbying is to convince the unaffiliated to back their cause. And each candidate has a position he takes for the future of the church. And this position might be made up of various different, we'll call them policy positions. The traditional Latin Mass could be a policy position. The Eastern rites, ecumenical dialogue, synodality, all this other stuff. A lot of things are part of the position. And it's really a remarkable thing what they do. It's really remarkable how it works. And there's signs now that there is a conclave coming. Before we get to that, I want to get to a prayer intention. Somebody emailed me this. They had a real prayer intention they wanted. And what they said is the following. They say, I've been viewing your channel for about a year now, and I've decided to ask you for a particular prayer intention. I'm asking you to keep my best friend in your prayers. She has gotten far from the Catholic faith despite not apostatizing because of doubts and insecurities that rose within her after she started discovering a Catholicism that was not the lukewarm version of it that was presented to her for the most part of her life. I am the only remaining serious practicing Catholic she knows, but I am aware that I do not know whether I have the capability to persuade one into coming closer to Christ. Therefore, I turn to Christ himself by praying and asking others to pray for this intention. If you could pray for this intention at the Mass for the first Sunday of Lent, that'd be tomorrow, I'd be eternally grateful. You can ask your viewers to pray for this intention as well. In addition, I wanted to ask, based on experience, if there was something I do to at least on a human level to make her grow closer to the Lord. Probably not. You can be an instrument for her conversion by talking to her earnestly about the faith and why she should actually take Catholicism more seriously. And usually the best way to do that is to convince her to pray more, to pray the rosary more. If you'll find that a lot of lukewarmness can be solved by even just the simple recitation of a single decade of the Holy Rosary every day. That might be your best intention. Essentially offer her to Our Lady. So he goes on to say he's brought her to a traditional Mass, and that didn't really help all that much. The traditional Mass is not the silver bullet for taking care of any problem in the church. It's just not. What it will do is help you be confronted with the more reverent form of worship that all of our ancestors had in the West until 50 years ago. But keep this person in your prayers, please. All having been said, there is positions coming for this conclave, and I will tell you that I would like to see the central position of the faction that wins to be restoring belief in the real presence of the Eucharist. We know that something like 18% of Catholics in the United States, and that's a high watermark in the West, by the way, something like 18% of Catholics in the West go to Mass on a regular basis. And by regular basis, they mean like once or twice a month. And we believe that of those who go to Mass on a regular basis, only 1 in 3 Catholics believe in the real presence of the Eucharist. This inspired the U.S. bishops to do things like spend $50 million on a Eucharistic revival. That involved processions, which are great, involved public prayer, which is great, exposition of the Blessed Sacrament and adoration, also great. And then like concerts at football stadiums and things, not so great. But they tried. Did it have an effect? Probably not. Because the people who were going to participate in that kind of thing were the people who believed in the real presence. I would like to see the Eucharist and actual fundamentals of the faith at the center of the program or the position for whatever the winning faction is at the coming conclave. Fortunately, that's not likely to be the case. Instead, what you're going to see is looming over all this uncertainty in the church right now is the USAID issue, Catholic charities, and the loss of federal funding because to not only the church in America, but the Vatican, because people have crunched the numbers and they decided, or they figured out that it looks like the Vatican gets like at least half of its funding from the US government directly or indirectly. So here we're going to go to our initial story on this, where some U.S. bishops have decided that what they really need to do is to lead a novena for migrants. Now, you might be thinking, well, what's wrong with a novena for migrants? Nothing really per se. What they're doing per se, if this is just at face value, sure, but this isn't, because when you see who the players are, the major players leading this novena, these are the same bishops and same cardinals in the United States who are actively acting partisan in political issues, trying to get the Catholics to stop supporting the current administration, because Catholics voted for the current administration. Catholics in the United States, just like everybody else, it seems like, supports what he's doing with migration as an issue. And as a general rule, the bishops seem pretty upset by this. And so you'll see the major players here, right? We'll go over this. But the headline is some U.S. bishops to lead 9-day online prayer for immigrants during Lent. This is from the, where else, National Catholic Reporter. And here, just to give you an idea who we have here. From the top row, left, right, are Cardinal Blaise Cupich, Cardinal Joseph Tobin, Bishop John Dolan. Pictured bottom row from left are Bishop Daniel Flores, Archbishop Nelson Perez, Archbishop Designate Joe Vasquez. I believe he's the Galveston, I want to say, and Archbishop John Wester. And this is kind of the rogues gallery of the Bergoglians in the United Church in America. And they're doing something that sounds super duper Catholic. But it's not exactly. So, because again, this is the issue, one of the big issues. If there's a conclave this year, it's going to loom large. So let's go over this story. A group of U.S. bishops, including 2 cardinals, will lead a 9-day Lenten prayer service for migrants and refugees in an online series sponsored by the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. The National Novena for Migrants and Immigrants will be held over 9 days, March 14th to 22nd, overlapping with the feasts of St. Patrick and St. Joseph, which are traditionally marked by Irish, Italian, and Polish immigrants in the United States. Scripture tells how Joseph led the refugee Holy Family out to Egypt. That's not true. He went from one province of Rome to another province of Rome. Egyptus was a province of Rome. This would be like him leaving California to go hang out in Arizona until something going on in California calmed down. Anyway, Patrick, according to tradition, was moved illicitly as someone in involuntary servitude to Ireland. Patrick and Joseph not only call attention to American immigrants, they are stories that help us think about the situation of migrants and immigrants today, said Stephen Millies, executive director of Catholic Theological Union's Bernardin Center, which is organizing the novena. Cardinal Bernardin was one of the great monsters of the 20th century in the church in America, to put it mildly. 7 bishops have confirmed their participation. Cupich of Chicago, Tobin of Newark, New Jersey, Archbishops Nelson Perez of Philadelphia and John Wester of Santa Fe, New Mexico, Archbishop Designate Joe Vasquez of Galveston, and Auxiliary Bishop Robert Lombardo of Chicago, and Bishop Daniel Flores of Brownsville, Texas. The 15-minute prayer services will begin at noon Central Time over Zoom. A novena done over Zoom. Nicely done, guys. Worship aids will be available in Spanish and English. Also included will be information about Catholic ministries serving migrants and immigrants. And this is all being done in response to migration, as they say, but they say it's going to be nonpartisan. It's effective solidarity through prayer. Give me a break. Give me a break. That's not what this is about. This is about money, because we are engaged in a highly political environment. The pressure is already being placed to conform to this. These are the highest profile cardinals that are also the same cardinals who demanded the president restore their funding for subverting the U.S. through illicit migration. And there's a subtext here. And this novena is part of a larger program to get lay faithful to stop supporting the efforts of the administration to restore security to the United States, and instead to get the feds to give them back their literally billions upon billions of dollars they took from the U.S. people by cutting off the spigot of tax dollars. The feds were giving tax dollars in the billions upon billions of dollars to the church through a whole host of means. It's also being done of the light of the very real possibility, by the way, that by midsummer we could have a papal conclave. And I say midsummer on purpose because there are some who are openly speculating that that Rome is doing everything they can to keep Francis around as long as possible, so that a certain cardinal from Africa, who is often called a traditionalist, will age out and not be able to participate in the conclave anymore, which would happen in June. If you want to have your tinfoil hat on for that one. But they think that this could lead, that we're going to have a papal conclave by the end of the year. That's what a lot of people are starting to think with this. And that this issue itself, USAID, Catholic Charities, we're going to loom large over it. The U.S. government's crackdown on our unwelcome visitors will cast a huge shadow over the whole thing, as well as the media and everything else. Because, again, we're talking billions upon billions of dollars, up to possibly half of the Vatican's annual budget every year, coming from the U.S. government, either directly or through NGOs who give money to Catholic organizations. And every time a Catholic organization gets money, a small portion of that goes to the Vatican, and it adds up very quickly. Everything these cardinals do now is to help stake out what Malachi Martin back in the 1970s called the position of their faction. Essentially, each faction at the conclave will have their chosen candidate for the papacy selected and a platform they'll represent for the future of the church. How that plays out, only our blessed Lord will know in the next when the next conclave comes. But the cardinals go into this process already with their political issue chosen ahead of time, who they want to rally around. Yes, and even your better cardinals. And if this sounds like it's brushing right up against those rules set by John Paul II in his document, adjusting canon law to make it so you can't politic at the conclave, you'd be right. It does brush right up to those rules. And we saw a hint of this, by the way, when Cardinal Pell was writing his anonymous letters as Demos to the College of Cardinals, trying to get them to not give us another Bergoglian-type pope after Francis is gone. So you saw this process. It's been going on for a long time. It is now obviously speeding up. And whatever else is part of the position of the modernists at the conclave, this issue, USAID, the funding from the government, will absolutely be part of the hyper-Bergoglian modernist faction. And again, pressure is being placed on laity to conform to this. I'm going to give you a case in point here of this. I know this is anecdotal, but a watcher or a listener to this podcast let me know on X what happened at their Ash Wednesday Mass. Ash Wednesday is probably the third most popular attended Mass of the year, after Christmas and Easter. And the priest who did this knew exactly what it was he was doing. So he went and did this. He says, at noon, Ash Wednesday Mass, celebrated by Archbishop Coyne, formerly Cardinal O'Malley's spokesman and subsequently a bishop in Vermont, closed by saying, give to Catholic relief services as almsgiving for Lent. We all need honesty, perhaps accompanying us in such reasoning. This is in your face. And that is absolutely true. Yeah, you had an archbishop at an Ash Wednesday Mass tell everybody to give to Catholic relief services as part of their Lenten almsgiving, if you can believe that. I'm not surprised by this. They're so concerned about money because the amount of money they've lost is incredible. It's not even small. We're not talking small. We're talking a lot. We're talking billions of dollars every year. But that's not the only movement happening with the Cardinals. Some are also starting to hedge their bets. You might have seen this story floating around social media since yesterday morning. Perhaps most incredibly, we now have a story of a cardinal who is suddenly changing his tune about the traditional Latin Mass. Kevin Tierney posted this on X who originally made by Unum Sanctum Catholicum, who wanted to make sure the person who made this gets credit. He says, how do you do, fellow Latin Masters? And the reason I laugh is because there's a story going around right now of Cardinal Arthur Roche. He's the architect of the ban of the Latin Mass. And Damian Thompson, who hosts the Holy Smoke podcast, as well as doing a lot of other work in exposing the crisis in Christendom and the crisis in the Catholic Church. He's an English traditional Catholic who writes on X, is deluded Uncle Arthur running for Pope? As this excellent analysis points out, Roche seems to be repudiating Traditionis Custodes, which Roche at least helped write. And the Catholic Herald, unbelievably, didn't ask the old thug why he hunted down traditional Catholics. So we're going to go here first to New Liturgical Movement for this happy little story, because it gives you the context that we need. And I'll tell you right now, I was not expecting flip-flopping like this. When you understand how Arthur Roche was probably one of the biggest bootlickers in Rome and remember, one of Pope Francis's actually more endearing traits for traditional Catholics is that he does not like ambitious people who want to use their position in the church for personal aggrandizement, who want to get as much power as they can. That's actually one of his more endearing traits. And apparently, Arthur Roche among other people, was pressuring Francis to sign a document that would essentially ban the traditional Latin Mass. And Francis was on the verge of signing it until he noticed that all the people around him were these very ambitious types, including Arthur Roche, and he decided not to do it. That's how the story goes. He says, ever since Traditionis Custodes was issued more than 3.5 years ago, its defenders have struggled to come up with a rationale for why it was issued at all. This is hardly surprising. The motu proprio Summorum Pontificum, in repudiation of which it is written, was the fruit of decades of careful mediation on the Church's liturgy problem on the part of one of the finest minds of our times. And the theological and pastoral problems which Benedict XVI addressed with such wisdom and sensitivity are not one whit less real and serious now than they were when he issued it. That is a fact which is not going to change within our lifetimes. Traditionis Custodes, on the other hand, was above all else an expression of fear. The fear of revolutionaries who know that their revolution is dying because it holds no interest for the rising generations. It was always going to be a difficult prospect to defend the spectacle of men in their 70s and 80s angrily berating people in their teens and 20s that they need to get with the times, but it's certainly been given the old college try. We were told that Pope Benedict's decision to issue Summorum Pontificum was above all motivated by the desire to foster the healing of the schism with the movement of Monsignor Lefebvre. That's in quotes because I know that Gregory de Pippo, the author of this piece, does not believe Archbishop Lefebvre was in schism, but Archbishop Arthur Roche certainly does believe that. We were told this even though Pope Benedict himself flatly stated that this was absolutely false. Yeah, Benedict XVI himself said the SSPX and Archbishop Lefebvre were not in schism. What Archbishop did was a schismatic act, but was not in schism. Anytime you basically, excoriate a pope, you're engaging in a schismatic act according to certain readings of the tradition of the church. But we'll continue. We were also told that in a survey whose contents had never been revealed, and as an aside, many of us don't think actually ever existed, the bishops of the world had alerted the Pope to the grave threat to the church's unity, which the adherents of the traditional Roman rite pose. At the same time, we have been constantly told ever since that there are very, very few such adherents. So few, in fact, that the bishops needn't worry too much about the sheep whose smell they are acquiring by wading into their midst and giving them a solid thrashing. We were told that it was therefore necessary to revoke the faculties granted by Summorum Pontificum in order to restore to the bishops their rightful role as guardians of the church's tradition and their authority over the liturgy which they needed to end this dangerous looming schism. The letter accompanying the newer motu proprio cited paragraph 27 of Lumen Gentium to that effect 4 times and said to the bishops, "It is up to you to proceed in such a way as to return to a unitary form of celebration and determine case by case the reality of the groups that celebrate with this Missale Romanum." That's the Missal of 1962. That's the book, the rule book for how to offer the traditional Mass, according to the last revision of it, which happened in 1962. At the same time, their authority to make such determinations was drastically curtailed by the motu proprio itself, and when many of the bishops used their authority still left to them to determine that there was no danger in their dioceses, their authority was further curtailed by the responses to a supposed set of dubia, and further still by the end run around Canon 87 enshrined in a rescript 2 years ago. There's your context for this most hilarious story. Catholic Herald gives us this headline: exclusive interview, Cardinal Arthur Roche. If only they knew most days I celebrate Mass in Latin. Now, some people might wonder why I'm laughing. And the reason I laugh when I say that, read that, the differences between the traditional Latin Mass, that is the Mass that developed organically from apostolic times until 19 1870 when the new Mass was promulgated, and the new Mass. The differences between the two are not simply that the priest faces the tabernacle, if he's got the good taste to have the tabernacle attached to his altar, and that he does it in Latin. Those are not the only differences. The fact, some studies have only 8% in common between the new Mass and the traditional Mass. A lot of Catholics will go to the new Mass in Latin, and then they will go to a traditional Latin Mass and feel initially fairly lost because there is so much different. More generous readings or arguments or analyses of the differences will say it's a 20 to 30% in common, but it's still a lot different. And so Cardinal Roche is trying to suddenly shift here to the middle for some reason, because he offers the Novus Ordo in Latin. How very dare he? This is the same person, by the way, who wrote the responses ad dubia, which was a dubia was issued after Traditionis Custodes in December on a Marian feast day that was on the pre-conciliar calendar. In December, a week before Christmas, he issued a response that made Traditionis Custodes much worse. And in that, he said that the bishops are not to allow accretions from the traditional Mass into the Novus Ordo, meaning you're not supposed to bring some of those elements from the traditional Latin Mass into the new Mass, including like versus, the ad orientem, meaning the priest with his back to the people, and other such things. He came down very hard line. He made Traditionis Custodes so much worse. He is pivoting, and I don't know why he is pivoting, but Mr. Let's bury the Latin Mass forever is pivoting his position. And the only reason that makes any sense for him to pivot his position on the traditional Mass is the context that we all live in right now, which is it looks pretty obvious that at some point in the not terribly distant future, there's going to be a conclave and a new pope is going to come. And he might be hedging his bets here, thinking, what if we get a more conservative pope? Somebody who wants the traditional Mass, doesn't like Traditionis Custodes. He's then wanting to keep his job. Or, I don't think he has a chance to become pope, but if he is the man, if Cardinal Roche is the man who emerges on that loggia as Pope Francis II or John Paul III or whatever name they would, John the 24th, whatever name he would choose, get on your knees and beg for God's mercy, because this man here would make an absolutely horrific pope. And I'm not saying that to be hyperbolic at all. Now, the chances of him becoming pope are minuscule, so that's good. But there are massive differences between that old Mass and the new, and he's trying to assuage people's fears by telling you that he prays his private Masses in Latin. Whoop-de-freaking-do. So here we go. Catholic Herald. Cardinal Arthur Roche is one of 4 English cardinals currently serving, a record high for the country. As the youngest among them, Cardinal Roche, 74, holds significant influence as prefect of the dicastery for divine worship and the discipline of the sacraments, and is a key advisor to Pope Francis. In this exclusive interview marking the golden jubilee of his ordination, Cardinal Roche reflects on his 5 decades of priesthood and distinguished service to the church. And he goes on like this, talking about his golden jubilee and all that other stuff. And he's a big believer in the actual movement of synodality and all the rest. Maybe I'll talk about that in a future stream. But here's what he has to say. When he's asked about being prefect for the dicastery of divine worship and then discipline of the sacraments, and when he's asked about the main challenges that in sacramental discipline, he says there are 2 sections of the dicastery. One is liturgy and the other is sacraments. The sacramental side deals with situations where something illicit or invalid has been celebrated. The disciplinary side is very different from the liturgical side. The liturgical side involves assisting in the reform of the Second Vatican Council, as outlined in Predicate Evangelium, the Apostolic Constitution of the Roman Curia, and supporting the bishops in this regard. He's repeating the lie that Vatican II called for a new Mass. It did not. If you read the document on the liturgy, it did not call for a new Mass. It called for some adjustments to the Missal of 1962, but it did not call for a new Mass. It's that some people with power to do so in the Roman Curia, then including Paul VI, took the ambiguities in that document and ran with them to give you a new Mass. He says, I would say the biggest challenge I've seen is a deep lack of formation regarding the liturgy in recent years. That's actually true, coupled with a growing tendency for individuals to believe they can worship in whatever manner they choose, rather than within the context of the church. We can only worship as a church. There is no other way. Worship is given to us by apostolic authority and through Christ. I see formation as essential. Without it, we witness either misinterpretations of the liturgy or its use as entertainment rather than the worship of God. Pope Francis has been particularly concerned about liturgical formation. 4 years ago, under Cardinal Roche, he asked the congregation to examine the question of formation. Following this, he wrote the apostolic letter, Desiderio Desideravi, which I often refer to as the Pope's love letter to the liturgy, addressed to the entire people of God. And he goes on to talk about how people should actually take the liturgy seriously, which leads into the Latin Mass section. And he's asked, one of the phenomena that has become apparent in the modern church is the devotion that young people have to the traditional Latin Mass, the 1962 Roman Missal promulgated by Pope John XXIII. What advice would you give to those who want to remain faithful members of the church and love the Latin Mass but find themselves restricted in attending? And he says, Cardinal Arthur Roche, Mr. I'm going to bury the Latin Mass forever. Mr. You don't want any parts of this influencing the new Mass. Don't have reverent Masses. This guy. He said, here's his response. Of course it is good that people want to be part of the church, and there's no reason why they cannot. There's nothing wrong with attending the Mass celebrated with the 1962 Missal. That has been accepted since the time of Pope St. John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and now Pope Francis. What Pope Francis said in Traditionis Custodes is that it is not the norm. For very good reasons, the church, through conciliar legislation, meaning the bishops, decided to move away from what had become an overly elaborate form of celebrating the Mass. When I was at school, I used to serve Mass, and the priest would say to me, remember, boy, it's 20 minutes amice to amice. And it's actually, he's wrong there. It's 30 minutes amice to amice, which means that you should be able to get a daily low Mass done. Monday through Friday, low Mass. For those who don't know what that is, in the traditional Latin Mass, there are several variations on it. But the two most common are the High Mass, which is where everything is sung. You have the Scola. Everything is sung except for the homily. Virtually everything else is sung, at least until the actual consecration. Often takes about an hour and a half to do, hour to an hour and a half. A low Mass is the spoken but often very quiet version. And I actually prefer that version. It takes about 45 minutes to do because the priest is praying things softly and the tone is much quieter. And it's, to me, at least, more solemn. But a good High Mass is still something incredible to attend. But a weekday low Mass can take 30 minutes. If you're doing it 20 minutes, it's probably going too fast. But, Arthur Roche was taught 20 minutes from beginning to end. What he meant was that as soon as I put the liturgical vestment around his neck, I was to start counting the minutes until he took it off at the end of Mass. If by chance he reached the last gospel by 15 minutes, at the end of the Latin Mass, you get another gospel reading. The last gospel is actually the beginning of John chapter 1, for those who don't know. I had to pull the back of his chasuble. It was a sort of scruple, I suppose, but something very different from what people experience in the extraordinary form today. One of the things that has been very interesting to me is observe this situation worldwide. The numbers devoted to the traditional Latin Mass are in reality quite small. It's also true, unfortunately, but some of the groups are quite clamorous. They're more noticeable because they make their voices heard. Another important point is that one of the major reforms of Vatican II was in Dei Verbum, which recognized that the scriptures need to become more and more part of the daily diet of every Catholic Christian. You get an astonishing amount of liturgy or scripture at the traditional Mass. You actually get more scripture at the traditional Mass than you do at the Novus Ordo. People have actually broken it down. It's just true. So this is another one of these like post-conciliar talking points that has no merit. It says in the lectionary from the Novus Ordo, there's a 3-year cycle for Sundays. We've heard that talking point before. What they never tell you when they tell you that there's a 3-year cycle for Sundays and 2-year cycle for weekday readings. There's a much lower percentage of scriptural readings in the 62 Missal than there are in the newer Missal. What they never tell you is that all the hard readings are taken out of the Novus Ordo Mass. When was the last time you were at a new Mass and you heard some of the harder readings about marriage or those who hated our Lord the most, or really anything that runs up against conventional secularized morality? When was the last time you heard most of those readings from the Mass? If you actually go into the lectionary and you see the readings, they're omitted. Sometimes they're considered optional, but most of the time they're omitted. And there's a reason for that. And he says, what interests me is why people get hot under the collar about others celebrating the Tridentine Mass. Really? I think this has been a mistake. Bishop Wheeler of the Diocese of Leeds insisted that a Holy Mass be celebrated in Latin according to the Novus Ordo at least once every Sunday in every deanery. That showed considerable wisdom. From my perspective, the celebration of the Eucharist, whatever missal you're using, should be very noble and marked by noble simplicity. I often hear people say Cardinal Roche is against the Latin Mass. Well, if they only knew that most days I celebrate Mass, meaning the Novus Ordo, in Latin because it is the common language for all of us here. It is the Novus Ordo Mass in Latin. I was trained as an altar boy until the age of 20, serving the Tridentine Mass. The only reason he would tell you that is because he's pivoting. Because there's an uncertain environment in Rome now. We don't know if we're going to get a Francis II or John the 24th, which would be basically Francis II, or if we're going to get a Leo the 14th. I doubt we're getting a Pius the 14th, but we might get or Pius the 13th. We might get a traditionally minded Pope, another Gregory Pope, or somebody like that. But the chances you're going to get a moderate to a Bergoglian type are very high. But he's hedging his bets, or he's trying to position himself as a candidate. I doubt that sincerely. I don't think Arthur Roche has much of a chance of becoming Pope. Now, this article got some wonderful responses. So we go here to Rorate Caeli with the headline, "The Miracles of the Pre-Conclave. Cardinal Roche says he has no problem with the Latin Mass." It's a miracle. It's sort of like, in the secular political world, a couple days ago, for some reason, Charlie Kirk decided to show up on Governor Gavin Newsom of California's podcast, and they had a very friendly conversation. Then Charlie Kirk posted it on his own podcasting platform. That's his prerogative. But in that interview, Governor Newsom sounded remarkably moderate when he is one of the most fringe politicians in the country. He's a character without principle. He shifts with the political winds. He's going to try to do his Bill Clinton impersonation to have a shot in 2028. And this is kind of what it looks like Arthur Roche might be doing. Now, he doesn't have much of a chance. But here's what Rorate Caeli had to say. It's very short. He says, "Well, that is a vibe shift if there ever was one. The great persecutor of the traditional Latin Mass, Cardinal Roche, apparently has no problem with Latin or the Latin Mass. What miracles do the heirs of a possible upcoming conclave bring forth?" And then it goes into, the question that I just going over with you over the Latin Mass. And they're not wrong. The very possibility of a conclave coming has shifted the behavior of cardinals. The more savvy ones are trying to dictate what the terms of the discussion will be at the conclave. That is what you see with Cardinal Supich, with his leading a novena for migrants and refugees and the rest, while also publicly fighting against the administration. They just lost in court over their funding from the administration, while also a different court said, "Hey, you got to give back money that was for already contracted things that went up through January 20th. They have to actually still pay them for that stuff." But in general, the bishops are losing this battle in the secular courts. So what are they trying to do? They're trying to change the hearts and minds of laity. All of this is with a conclave coming. Whether that conclave is probably not next month, maybe in the summer, maybe next year or the year after. We don't know. Only the Lord knows when he's going to call Francis home. But the bishops are giving you all the signals you need to know that they believe something is coming. And they're positioning themselves for it. They want to dictate the terms of the discussion at the conclave before it even happens. Take that to the bank. Arte says, miracles? Well, suddenly the guy who was an anti-traditional Mass is suddenly very pro. Oh, yeah, you could have your traditional Mass. It just was a little divisive. It wasn't divisive. The Mass wasn't divisive. What it showed was that people understood the faith. And they started learning the faith in ways that haven't been taught at their typical Sunday parish anymore. They began to see the things going on in the church for a very long time, predating Francis, were a problem, to say the least. Damien Keller with the generous super chat. Thank you, sir. It is appreciated. First Friday was also the first Friday of Lent on March 7th. 7 sorrows, 7 virtues. Our bishops will not do penance for themselves nor call the faithful to sacrifice. We are a time of sackcloth and ashes. Fatima, Our Lady doesn't lie. Exactly right. When was the last time you heard a bishop preach about Fatima? And if you did, guarantee you it was either one of the very publicly better bishops or one of the ones who keep their powder dry, we'll say, who hold off on things until they have a good time, a good reason to speak. That's a lot of your bishops. I'm not going to name names. There's a few that come to mind who are on the level. You sometimes see them in the company of Cardinal Burke or Bishop Bishop Schneider. Maybe they've publicly said some nice but safe things about Bishop Strickland. Those bishops. But other than them, you don't hear Fatima ever brought up, really. Or if you do, it's like brought up as a historical thing, as opposed to a nightmare that we're living through right now. And that you have free will to do something about it. Unfortunately, this is not First Saturday. That was last Saturday. But if you haven't kept the 5 First Saturdays devotion, you should do so once in your life. Just make sure that to check the calendar for the 5 consecutive months, that make sure that it doesn't conflict with, say, plans that you've already made that you can't get out of, or that that first Saturday doesn't happen to fall on a major feast day or something where that could throw the liturgical norms into chaos for you. But in general, make sure to take this seriously. I'm curious what people think about this. Are you that surprised that that we have that you see this positioning? Mike from over on X. I'm starting to dual cast this on X, by the way, for those who might be watching this. He says, fascinating analysis. I thought Francis II was a shoo-in, especially in light of the push to change the voting rule, the conclave 50% majority. It hasn't happened yet. It could happen, but it hasn't happened yet. But in light of Cardinal Roche's ostensible pivoting, I'm beginning to wonder if this is not a foregone conclusion. And that's a good question. We don't know. Pay attention. If you do see that document coming, it is going to be the thing that upends all of this. And because it will mean that Francis is accepting that his time is running short and he needs his work to continue under somebody he trusts. All right, folks. I'm curious what you have to say about this, so let me know in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media. That helps a lot, too. And if you've ever thought about supporting the work of this the little operation we have here, you can do through a Patreon and Subscribe Star. Links in the description box below. That join button is a great option, too. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.